Japan up close.
The first time I went to Japan was in the summer of 1992. I visited Tokyo and Kamakura for about 11 days. I was just fascinated. The whole notion of how dense the city was, of how creative it was, of how it was on the frontier, the quality of the food, the friendliness of the people. It was just a phenomenal experience. And since that time, I've been interested to learn as much as I possibly can about the literature of Japan, the history of Japan, the different geographical parts of Japan. And of course, it was then the world's #2 economy, still the world's #3 economy. So as an economist, I've long felt Japan is simply something I have to know about. Well, for some time now, the population of Japan has been shrinking due to low birth rates. So the macroeconomic aggregates do not always look great. But if you consider Japan in per capita terms, per capita productivity, per capita income growth, the country has done okay. It has not been a spectacular performance, but to manage a declining population with such grace and order and with still such humane lives has been a real achievement that I feel the rest of the world can learn a great deal from. The Complacent Class is first and foremost a book about America. It is an argument that Americans have grown too risk-averse, too sluggish, not ambitious enough, unwilling and unable to take on big, earth-shattering projects, and just a bit lazy and overly self-satisfied culturally, economically, in many areas, except probably for the tech community in Silicon Valley. So it was a critique of American society. Now, I think Japan is a very interesting illustration of a different path for the complacent class. So there's been a lot of complacency in Japan, as I understand it, a kind of sluggishness in some regards, but you have a much more orderly version of that sluggishness. We have a lot of the underlying defects of American society, inequalities of well-being, a highly uneven education system, and we have been sitting around and doing nothing about that. It seems to me that Japan, on one hand, was first a pioneer of a kind of complacency, but that you all have been better able to afford complacency because your norms of intra-societal cooperation are much better developed than ours. So this is a comparison that I've been studying really for the last 30 years or so. I strongly feel that the world as a whole needs to move to a much lower level of carbon emissions. But for each and every nation, the path to get there will be economically painful. So Japan's best chance for carbon neutrality would have been to stay nuclear. But for reasons related to Fukushima, Japan has not wanted to do that. So you will have to make a more costly, economically painful transition to wind and solar power. So this is not a positive in terms of the economy. It's good for the environment. It's something humanity has to do, but it won't help Japan. And furthermore, the positive contribution you make will be dwarfed by America, China, and possibly India. So there's a kind of free rider problem here. If Japan makes a positive contribution, but America and China do not, your positive contribution will wash out and it won't really help Japan much at all. So you're in a difficult position. You're being asked to incur costs. Your activities on the positive side may not make a big global difference. And I think this will be a slow and sluggish path for many countries, Japan included. Japan needs more world-class companies. If you look at Japan in, say, the mid to late 1980s, there were so many Japanese companies that were at the technological frontier of the entire world, very often better than American companies in terms of quality or reliability. But if you think of, say, the last 20 years as mostly having been about the tech revolution, the major tech companies really are not Japanese at all. Digital innovation has been first American and then Chinese. It's not clear that Japan is next in line to be #3. And at the same time, manufacturing jobs, to produce a car, it employs fewer people than ever before. So Toyota is still a successful company, but it does not give as many Japanese middle class to upper middle class jobs as it used to. So the general deindustrialization through automation has lowered the number of good jobs in Japan. Tech has not arisen in Japan to fill that place. Japanese companies will need to find new niches in many different areas. Overall, I am optimistic about this prospect, but I think we're still at a point where it has not quite yet happened. I'm not sure it's up to the Japanese government. So Japanese culture, as I see it, is at a kind of turning point. There are some key questions the Japanese need to confront, such as how many immigrants will you take in? How easy will you make it for immigrants? How easy will it be for those immigrants to assimilate? What exactly will be your relationship with a more aggressive China? Will you succeed in some manner of reaching a kind of actual peace with Korea, culturally speaking? How much will you remain in terms of foreign policy within the American orbit? I do not pretend to have all of the answers to these big questions, but what I see in past history is Japan and Japanese culture. A number of times they've made very sudden turning points, very often for the better, and have surprised people with capabilities that were not immediately obvious on the surface. This would include the post-war reconstruction, also the Japanese response after Commodore Perry came and in essence forced open the country. So I think actually we are due for another one of these, but Japan is one of the hardest countries to predict when it comes to its turning points. So I can't tell you exactly what it will be, but Japan, precisely because there's so much stasis, all these big choices are building up. And at some point, they're going to spill over into what Japan is. Every sector is becoming the tech sector. And you see this in America with Tesla, which is in essence a car built out of software. Tesla or something like it will be highly successful. So I think Japan needs a stronger startup scene. They've made some steps in that direction already. They've made big steps in terms of using women in the labor force more effectively. That will be a major positive going forward. But I think there is something about Japanese culture that those who are rebellious are pushed in a direction other than being productive. They withdraw from society. Those individuals, arguably, you want leading more startups. So I think some kind of cultural change is necessary to get Japan being more of a startup center. And it is very easy to live in terms of rent and living conditions. But in terms of language, it's one of the hardest places to live in. And I'm not sure exactly how that will change, but I feel that's another one of these cultural divides. How much exactly will Japan incorporate English into living in Japan? Will it end up like, say, Sweden, where English really is a second language? Or will it still be the case that English proficiency is not taken for granted and sort of reading signs, talking with people can quite often remain a struggle, especially outside of Tokyo? I'm not sure, but I think that's another one of the big choices facing Japan right now. Japan and Japanese production, they still have this obsession with high quality and execution and design, both on large scales and in small. This advantage has not gone away. What has changed is a lot of the old style manufacturing firms are not as important as they used to be. So Japan needs to relearn how these fundamental advantages, which are still fully there in the culture, that they are redirected toward the service sector, toward tech, and toward startups. So the service sector in Japan, it still has too many small firms. They are too inefficient. That service sector is still too heavily regulated. And that will be a slow, sticky, and messy process pulling that apart. But to look at just one area, look at food. Japanese food is the best in the world. I don't just mean Japanese cuisine, but different cuisines as they are executed in Japan. The quality execution is phenomenally high. Those skills are embedded more deeply in Japanese culture. You see it in interior design, in architecture, simply in how very small products are made, how beautiful they are, how nicely things are wrapped. Those are fundamentals. They are not going anywhere, but they do need to be redirected toward new and different innovations.
Japan Up Close.